Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. One of my very favorite quotes about Canada-US relations comes from historian Bartlett Brebner. Americans, he says, are benevolently ignorant about Canada, while Canadians are malevolently well-informed about the US. And as we are witnessing these days, proximity is no guarantee of understanding. Today, the Prime Minister met with Canadian officials to talk about Canada-US relations. He sort of bounded into the room saying, "We've got this," made some other comments off camera a little later that said he was very worried that this is really about Canada becoming the 51st state. So we'll talk about all of that today with Trevor Tombe. He is a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, research fellow at the School of Public Policy. And one of the things that's really interesting in your work, Trevor, is you serve as co-director of finances of The Nation, which is a project, academic researchers that really crunch the numbers on public data. So you actually started or I think your piece was yesterday, sort of saying the impact of this is already being felt, that there is not just in terms of investment, but in terms of uncertainty and fear and concern. How did you assess that?
That's right. Well, first, thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today. So, the piece yesterday, I think, really revealed some startling new data on a particular measure of uncertainty, policy uncertainty in Canada. It's, of course, tough to measure precisely, but a really strong team of researchers in the US do this for many countries and link this measure of uncertainty to real economic outcomes, business investment, economic growth, employment, and so on. And what we saw in January, perhaps not surprisingly, was that the measure of economic uncertainty in Canada spiked to its highest ever recorded level.
Higher than COVID.
Higher than COVID, and not by a little bit, by a pretty wide margin. We have uncertainty simultaneously occurring in lots of important areas. Think about federal political leadership question, right? That raises uncertainty around federal policy, trade with the United States, a critical source of both exports and imports for much of Canada's economy, potentially disrupted by a 25% across the board tariff. Add to that, other types of uncertainties, on
Elections,
taxes,
maybe.
indeed, elections, when they will be, what the outcome might be, but even simple things like taxes, capital gains taxes, not having passed through Parliament, yet being enforced up until at least recently. So it makes it really hard to plan, both as an individual, but more importantly for a business thinking about large investments into, say, a new manufacturing facility or expanding resource extraction activities and what have you. It's probably prudent to pause and await some of the resolution of this uncertainty.
Well,
And that is a big negative effect on Canada's economy.
Yeah, and I mean, we're having this issue. I don't know how many studies that have been done that says investment is so slow and almost non-existent, and our productivity is so low vis-a-vis the Americans.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering, I heard all this optimistic, highly nationalistic rhetoric from the folks at the conference today, but it's not like we haven't had wake-up calls. COVID made it very clear that we had atrophied our manufacturing sector, allowed that to happen, that we had supply chain issues. Then the Biden government stateside introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, which was just this big siphoning off of investment dollars to the US. We tried to counter with some, programs to give companies money to come here. Now we've got the Trump tariffs. Is this the one that is actually going to help us focus and react?
Well, I hope so. And I'm of two minds here. First, I think
Yeah.
all the challenges you noted is absolutely correct. And these challenges have been mounting for many years now. That productivity gap between us and the United States, maybe it's worth putting some numbers to that. I think many
Yeah.
Canadians are not aware that in 2024, it looks like the United States produced about 50% more per person than Canada. 50% more.
Wow.
That's roughly double the typical gap. Them being a more productive economy has been
Yeah.
a constant throughout Canadian history, but this wide of a gap is really unprecedented. You have to go back just to the tail end of World War II to find a comparably large gap. And for it to be persistently large, you have to go back to the late 19th century. We're in a very unusual situation where Canada's economy is just roughly stagnated on a per person basis. And that's largely because of productivity growth falling off a cliff. And a
And
lot of
we've
that is
got,
tied to business investment.
well,
Uh,
no, I mean, they're looking at a system, obviously, stateside, where the tax system is friendlier, where they don't have all the interstate restrictions that we have between and amongst provinces in the same
mhm,
way. They've got
that's
higher
right.
mobility of labor. Actually, let's just talk about that for a bit
Sure.
because the federal government is talking about this a lot. It actually isn't in their bailiwick.
That's
They
right.
put restrictions on trade, but interprovincial trade barriers are the business of the provinces.
That's
So
exactly
do you
right.
get the sense that they too have realized that this is for real?
There has certainly been a lot more attention paid, at least rhetorically, to the challenge
Mhm.
of interprovincial trade in Canada. And it's at a level that I haven't seen in some time, which might be a sign there's a willingness on the part of governments to act. But, and this is an important but, I haven't heard a single provincial political leader really accurately articulate exactly what it is they'd like to do. They kind
Mhm.
of generically speak about interprovincial trade frictions as a problem, but never really say what they are. And it is important to keep in mind what they are. It's not like we're taxing each other's imports from another province.
Yeah, we're not
Um,
putting tariffs on one
that's
another
right. That's
then.
right. Thankfully. But we have differences in rules and regulations and standards and certifications where if your item is compliant with health and safety rules in one province, it might not be in another, or the rules might be very similar, but you as a business have to go through additional hoops to receive certification in the other province. And so these differences in the rules just add costs to exchanging across borders, adds costs to operating across borders. And the way to eliminate these frictions is, well, there's a slow way where provinces could harmonize, negotiate and come up with a common set of rules. And that's fair, but it takes a long time.
Yeah.
An alternative would be for a province to simply recognize as valid compliance with another jurisdiction's rules if your truck
That's kind of your
configuration.
theory, this mutual recognition
Exactly.
policy. Okay, if you've trained a nurse, we believe she's trained. If
Exactly.
you've trained a carpenter, we believe he's trained.
That's right. Or if the truck configuration is
Yeah,
valid in Saskatchewan, it's automatically
yeah,
good to go in Alberta, even if technically it doesn't comply with the local rule. And
yeah.
so that is a much quicker, potentially much broader, much more effective way to make some real progress here. And I haven't heard a political leader say that they'd like to do something like that.
I think
And until they do, it's hard to really see that they're willing to take the serious steps that are required. And maybe they just want to focus on things like alcohol and wine shipment, which is fair
right.
enough, but not something that would really move the needle economically.
Yeah. What are the numbers? And I want to come back to the tariff issue on the numbers, but say the provinces all woke up tomorrow morning and said, okay, we're going to do this mutual recognition
Mhm.
approach to our policies. And no, we're not going to make trucks change their tires every time they hit a provincial border, which is
Mhm.
actually a rule. Fortunately, they don't enforce it every day. But what kind of an impact would that have in dollars and cents? And particularly, I guess, in the next 30 days. Is this something that could be substantive in terms of dollars and cents?
Yeah, it's very large in terms of the impact that it has on Canada's economy and productivity. The most recent research on this is actually done by myself and co-author Ryan
Yep.
Minucha in a 2022 paper that we put out for the Macdonald Laurier Institute that looks at mutual recognition as a potential way forward and the gains. And We find that these interprovincial frictions, if you could get rid of them, like mutual recognition across the board on everything, might boost the size of Canada's economy by somewhere between 4.5 to just shy of 8. There's some margin of error around how we
Uh,
estimate it, but that's large. On the low end,
Yeah.
a 4.5% boost to the Canadian economy just alone would be equivalent to about 140 billion dollars a year in additional economic activity. And on the high end, if
Yeah.
we
That's
have a
significant.
boost of 8%, then that's equivalent to nearly 250 billion. And so, relative to that gap between us and the United States, this move alone might shave off roughly a quarter of of that gap. And so it'd
Yeah.
be something that is, I think, worth us really taking seriously. It's not the only thing we should be doing to
Right.
boost competitiveness in Canada. So regulatory processes, tax changes, and a long list of things we can do. But this is perhaps the lowest hanging fruit if provinces really want to take steps to improve the Canadian economy.
And on the big ticket items, well, everybody has noted with interest that even those in the federal cabinet that were saying, oh, no, we don't need pipelines and we don't need more energy projects, and we've got all these rules in place, Bill 69 and others, to prevent them. Actually, the big thing that stops it is Quebec, who said there will be no pipeline go across our territory, and they've reiterated that very strongly.
Yeah, and this is an interprovincial trade issue. Pipelines
Absolutely.
are the most efficient way to transport oil and gas, and our ability to ship it east-west is important. So thinking about Northern Gateway again
Yeah.
is something that I think should absolutely be on the table. But the challenge is broader than just pipelines as well. Rail capacity, port capacity, like Canada's infrastructure challenges are a part of what limits our ability to trade with ourselves, but also limits our ability to trade with other countries.
Yeah.
Having port capacity and rail capacity basically right now maxed out really prevents us from physically shipping
Well,
goods where they
Canadians
need to go.
do sort of have to understand that even our own pipelines run through US
That's
territory,
right.
right?
That's
It
right.
goes
Yeah.
down and comes back up. So even if we want to service ourselves, we have to resolve some of these issues. I
Yeah.
think you've done some work on this as well, and correct me, I'm not sure what the number, whether it was a billion or I'm pretty sure 670 billion. This was your stat on kind of lost energy projects writ large, mining projects, etc., because of red tape rules and regulations that say and sign off by Indigenous communities and the whole lot here,
Yeah.
that this is what we've lost in the last very few years.
Yeah, whatever the specific number actually is, it's hard for that number to be small.
Yeah.
Energy investment and production and our ability to export it and receive competitive world prices for it has enormous economic implications in Canada. Think about the amount of oil that we produce and ship to the United States on the order of 4.5 million barrels per day. And so each $1 that you shave off the price received by producers translates into significant lost income for workers, for businesses, for governments in Canada. And infrastructure is a part of that. Like the reason why there is this price gap between what we produce here and what world prices are elsewhere is transportation bottlenecks. And when those bind really tightly, you see periods where that differential between our price and others widens quite a bit. In 2018, we saw this rise to really significant levels, I believe peaking at around $50 per barrel gap in the price that we received just because
It's
of, in
amazing.
that case, pipeline bottlenecks. So Trans Mountain
Yeah.
was a very important project to help
Right.
ease those pressures, but it, it it shouldn't be the end of it. Trans Mountain was welcome, but a little more would be even more welcome. Then putting the economics aside, there is, as we're now seeing with potential risks of our exposure to the United States, there might be broader strategic considerations for
Yeah.
Canada. They go beyond just the dollars and cents here that we really should keep in mind. So if there are infrastructure projects that, having them routed not through the United States might add to some of the costs of the
Exactly.
project itself, but it still might be worth doing. And that I
But
think
the
needs to be a part of the conversation too. Our strategic orientation
yeah.
requires infrastructure investments that'll give us options with others.
But even with the federal government using, of course, tax dollars to go in and rescue, quote unquote, the pipeline and see that built, you're still hearing from the private sector, this is not a place that we want to risk dollars and cents at this point. There are just too many political, infrastructure,
Yeah.
regulatory consultation. We've imposed so many restrictions on
Mhm.
this. They're just going, why do business here? It's too complicated.
And I think the broader issue, or at least how I think about these kind of regulatory burdens, is that uncertainty is a big part of it. It's
Yeah.
not just that there are, stringent environmental rules and so on that we wish proponents and producers or resource developers to meet. It's that there's uncertainty in the timeline, or there's no certainty if a project does actually tick all the right boxes, takes the prudent steps to ensure it's high in terms of meeting environmental standards. There's no certainty that it would be approved at the
Yeah.
end of the day. So I think that many in industry I think would agree with this, that stringent rules is fair enough if that's what Canadians want, but have clear, timely, efficient rules, clearly defined objectives that we're trying to achieve, and certainty that if you go through those steps and abide by the rules, that it will be approved. And so there's timeline uncertainty and political uncertainty where you might have cabinet rejecting
Yeah,
outright
and
an
the
investment.
federal government always interfering in quote provincial jurisdiction, so everything ends up in court. So then there's another 5 years delay as we figure out who has the right to do what.
Yeah. And so for me, I hope that improvements, especially federally in terms of regulatory processes, makes them more timely, more efficient, more predictable, more certain, which is different than I think some might be concerned about, say, watering down the
Mhm.
regulations that we had. And that's not how I think about it at all. Just make them efficient, timely, clear, predictable, and then businesses will be able to navigate the rules of the game.
I was surprised to watch Mark Carney announce on the same day as this summit his carbon tax uh, proposal, because we've watched many federal cabinet ministers kind of run away from this, that we're going to undo the carbon tax, and the carbon tax has served its purpose. He's not calling it a carbon tax. It's a little bit more like the clean fuel standard, which has a lot more regulatory side to it again, which just plays into this very issue and concern you've just been talking about, which is more unpredictability, more uncertainty, more red tape.
Yeah, that's certainly how I view the proposal that Mr. Carney put forward. It has multiple parts to it, but maybe one that
Hmm.
I'll focus on here because it is related to questions of Canada's international trade is what's called a carbon border adjustment. And so this was one
Right.
part of what Mr. Carney proposed, and yeah, that's certainly an interesting policy from a theoretical perspective, where you levy on an import, but you don't levy on an export, a tax on items related to their emissions intensity. So think of it like a carbon tax, but levied at the border. The challenge, though, is to know precisely what tax to levy, because the emissions embodied in a product from one producer might be different than another, and it might be different from one country to another. So in practice, I think it would just be a really difficult system to navigate because we wouldn't know exactly what levy to put on, and we'd have endless disputes with
Right.
companies who point out, actually, we're more efficient than you think. We should have a lower levy. And so it would create uncertainty on international transactions in a way that would detract from trade volumes, and that has significant implications for Canada. Even the EU, which has moved somewhat towards implementing this policy, they've done it in very narrow, targeted product categories. And so
Mhm.
my view tends to be that a smaller country like Canada that is very intensively oriented towards international trade shouldn't be experimenting on these sorts of policies. If larger economies like the EU or the US at some point want to think about it, well, then we could have conversations about how we get integrated with those broader systems. But for us to go it alone, I think is particularly risky. And now I think also, how would it look in the United States if we start levying
Exactly.
taxes on imports from the United States? That it just might
That's what I
create.
mean. The timing of this is even worse in terms of it's a carbon tax by another name, and we're going to hit you with it to the Americans. I mean, it just
Yeah.
seems
And so
unnecessarily provocative.
in my view, we should be thinking about how to support provinces in terms of their own carbon pricing systems. Most provinces now have
Yeah.
systems that have levies on larger industrial emitters. Alberta has the largest of them,
Yeah.
and these are policies that are not particularly controversial. I think it's fair to say not controversial politically. All kind of parties right across the spectrum provincially support such systems, and we can think about how to make them more efficient, how to maybe integrate them better across provinces. Speaking to interprovincial trade
Right.
challenges, different rules in different systems do create some frictions for companies trying to operate across provincial borders. So, not introducing one new policy after the next, but just have some focus on improving what we have would, I think, go a lot further without risking creating the kind of policy uncertainty that is a drag on investment.
Yeah, because I mean, we have these discussions at every level, including securities regulation and asking
Mhm.
companies if they're going to invest, then they've got to worry about, 10 provinces, and we just make it so complicated. Okay, I want to come back officially to the tariff question
Mm.
here. Um, so I'm just going to ask you to stand back a minute and say, what do you really think this is about from Trump's mind? I see this guy as, and it keeps getting reinforced. He's a real estate guy, right? So Gaza Strip, Greenland, like it simplifies things if you just own the territory and you need the stuff that's in it. And then we'll worry about all these flags and sovereignty issues later. I mean, is that how he's coming at this? I mean, nobody's going to invade Canada with a military and take us over.
Yeah, it is really hard to, I think, from the outside, fully understand what the
Yeah.
underlying objective and motivation is of the president on trade policy. I think one constant throughout his life, is
Yeah.
concerns around trade imbalances.
Yep.
He has been very opposed to trade deficits with different countries quite vocally. In the 80s, it was with respect to Japan, very vocal critic of trade policy then. So I think that is a genuine concern just because it has been a feature of his thinking around international trade for so long,
Yeah.
predating his time in politics. And the US does have trade deficits with many. It imports more from Canada than the reverse, much of that because of oil and gas, just
Of
as an
energy. I
aside.
think they get 60% of their oil and gas from us. And if you took that out of the equation, they don't have a trade deficit.
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. The U.S. data
Yeah.
is quite clear. You strip out oil and gas,
Yeah.
and they have a trade surplus.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure it's all that productive to think about
Exactly. Yeah.
an education campaign for the
Right.
president to try and look at the nuances here. And so I think that is genuine, and maybe we should be thinking about, are there steps that we can take in Canada to help in the longer term try and address this trade balance? And I tend to think that there is, and it's connected to the issues that we've been talking about, the overall competitiveness and strength and productivity and investment environment within Canada is in part why our dollar is low.
Yeah.
Right. If we had a stronger investment environment in Canada and we could attract more international capital, there would in effect be a larger demand for the Canadian dollar, which would increase
Exactly.
its price. And that's relevant because it's connected to the cost of importing and exporting. If we have a
Yep.
high dollar, then now from our perspective, imports from the US are a little cheaper. And from their perspective, imports from Canada would be a little more expensive. And so it would tend to see us export to them a little less and us import from them a little more. And that would help shrink and potentially
Yep.
even reverse the trade imbalance that is such an irritant to the president. And it's kind of a win-win in the sense that if we can improve the investment environment in Canada, that is something we ought to do for its own sake. But an
Hmm.
interesting side benefit is a stronger value in the Canadian dollar that over time might help take this trade imbalance issue that is receiving such attention by the
Well,
president off the
and a
table.
lot of the things he's asking about the border and paying defense bills are stuff we should be doing anyway. And we most particularly should be focused on our own economic issues here, which is why aren't people investing in this country and why is our productivity 50% of our closest and largest trading partner? You know,
Yeah.
that's what we need to focus.
The investment flows between Canada and the United States, I think, are also quite stark. The trade surplus, all in goods and services, for us is about 100 billion last year. Sorry, in 2023. But
Yeah.
the financial flows, like the foreign direct investment of companies or the portfolio investment of individuals or pension funds and so on from Canada to the US was on the order of $400 billion that year. So on net, the overall balance of payments, when you look at both trade and financial flows, is heavily tilted towards the United States. We invest a lot more there
Yeah.
than they invest in Canada.
Well, you hear this from Canadian businessmen. I have these conversations, business people, all the time, and saying, "What are you doing here?" Nothing. I'm not investing here. I'm in Sweden. I'm in the US. I'm in, some part of Europe. There's just too much uncertainty. And these are Canadian companies located here.
And investment is, it's kind of self-evidently important. It is how
Yeah.
we, expand facilities to produce goods and services. It allows us to adopt new technologies and so on. But just to, I guess, relate this to productivity and growth,
Yeah.
90% of the labor productivity growth, like the amount that we produce per hour, is from business investment since 2000. And so it is central to productivity growth. And productivity growth is, for us as individuals, central to the affordability challenges and the purchasing power of our income. If you look over time about how much we earn per hour worked, all in, adjusted for inflation, it tracks almost perfectly with labor productivity. So the reason why our affordability challenge is as high as it is not just inflation and prices rising, but
Right.
think about the other side of this equation. It's how much income are we generating relative to those prices?
Exactly.
And that growth has slowed. Only twice before in Canadian history have we experienced a near decade of slower disposable income growth than we are now. One of them
Well,
being
and we upped the
depression.
immigration numbers to the point that it just sort of divided that number even further, because there were more people dealing with the same economic output because as new arrivals or outside the system arrivals, they weren't contributing.
Yeah, so I'm not being an expert in immigration policy, I'll leave that to others, but certainly is the move away from the point system in particular,
Yeah,
where now it's
yeah.
less about skills attraction, it's much more about just increasing the denominator. But this divergence between Canada and the United States is traced back to 2015. For the 20 years prior to 2015, the Canadian and U.S. economies moved together. Not perfectly every quarter, but for those 20 years, we grew by almost exactly the same amount as the United States, both up and down. So during recessions, disruptions, during energy booms and energy busts, following the September 11th and the dot-com burst, our economies grew together. After 2015, things changed. And that has just grown and widened the gap between us over time. So the
So we
past
knew
10
that
years
was
is,
an election year. So what did you
yeah.
see specifically starting then that impacted all of these issues so negatively?
Yeah, so several issues. We've talked about federal policy adding to some uncertainty, and I think
Yeah,
that's indeed part of it, no question. But we also experienced a drop in commodity prices in
yeah,
2015 and 2016, and that was a big negative hit to the Canadian economy because it really did undermine the level of investment in oil and gas in particular. So there was that. Plus, shortly after 2015, we had US developments in 2016 and
yeah.
NAFTA renegotiation. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the trade front around then, too. So there were a lot of simultaneous challenges for the Canadian economy. Some, I think, in terms of domestic origins, things that we've done to ourselves, if you will, and some
Yeah.
external in nature that a small open economy like Canada is often needing to respond to developments beyond its control. And I think now we're learning that while we can't control U.S. policy, it is especially important in the face of uncertainty abroad to make sure our own domestic policy is as good as it can possibly be. And I think we've kind of moved away from that as a focus
Yeah.
that hopefully will return to a more economic orientation to policymaking in Canada.
I want to come back and I've got three or four points I want to touch on. So retaliatory tariffs and do
Mm.
we cut off our nose to spite our face in a sense? Is spending programs, COVID style spending the answer? Boycotts, do they mean anything? But let's just look at this issue of retaliatory tariffs. I think everybody watched with interest as Daniel Smith went down and talked and engaged and had that conversation, and took it seriously and benefited from that. A proposed 10% tariff as opposed to 25, that we do have to see this as a negotiation. So that's kind of one way to respond. But secondly, our our tariffs, I mean, if we know that's one of the president's favorite tools in the toolbox, but do retaliatory tariffs work when we're the smaller player?
Yeah, that's a really important point to keep in mind that tariffs have different effects depending on the size of the country levying them.
Right.
So this is kind of very, very well known. It's also fairly intuitive that if you're a large country that enacts a tariff on your imports, then you move the needle considerably in terms of demand for
Right.
those imported goods. And if you drop demand for something, you tend to lower its price. So when a big country levies a tariff, it can have the effect of lowering prices in other countries. Think about it as Canadian producers taking a haircut on what they charge US
Yep.
buyers. And I think we would see that. Whereas the reverse, if Canada enacts a tariff, it's very hard for us to move the needle at all in terms of like the overall demand that producers in the States would face. Just for some perspective here, we did have retaliatory measures announced last week. Thankfully, we didn't need them, but their magnitude relative to US output is very small. The most exposed US state, it was Wisconsin.
Wisconsin,
And
right.
the retaliation on exports as a share of their economy was equivalent to only 0.5% of their GDP, and potentially somewhere around half that, 0.2 or 0.3% of their production.
So they're
Of
not going to
goods
feel
and
it. They're not going to respond to it. There's not going to
yeah.
be any political pressure as a result.
And so even if Canadians dropped their imports in half, which is crazy and way bigger,
Yeah.
we would hit Wisconsin, the most exposed state, by something on the order of 0.1%
Yeah.
of its output. So it's really hard for us to exert meaningful pressure on U.S. producers. And
Well, it was,
ultimately, then tariffs are then just borne by Canadians in the form of a
yeah,
higher price.
higher prices here. It was interesting to watch Elon Musk the other day when Doug Ford said, we're going to kill the Starlink contract, and he said, "Ho hum." Right? It's given everything he's doing in the world, it was not that
Yeah.
big a chunk of change.
Yeah. And so, how I think about retaliation is that there certainly is a lot of public pressure on governments. And so, I
Yeah.
can understand needing to retaliate in some ways, but I'd really restrict those to just symbolic goods,
Yeah.
things that are easy to substitute away from. If we're having a tariff on Kentucky bourbon because it
Yeah.
facilitates a more effective marketing and lobbying campaign in the States, I can understand that. But broad-based retaliation
Yeah.
with the goal of exerting economic pressure on the United States, I think this is not possible. And we really want to constrain our instinct to retaliate and focus on things that might be more productive, if that's diplomatic engagement or what have you. So
Yeah. Having the
the
conversations.
last time we had a broad-based tariff levied on our trade with the United States was under President Nixon in 1971. There was a 10% across the board tariff levied then, and we didn't retaliate at all, which I think was the wise move at the time.
Mm.
Because retaliation, especially in Canada, 4 out of every $5 we trade with the United States is a
Yeah.
business input. Like trade is the foundation of our ability to make things. And so tariffs are not just increasing prices for consumers, they potentially can disrupt the very supply chains that Canada's economy
Yeah.
relies on. So the economic damage can be quite considerable.
Yeah, Donald Trump doesn't care if we boycott California wine. He doesn't like California politicians anyway. And if we're just cutting off our nose to spite our face, financially speaking, then eventually there will not be political support for that here either when the prices start to go up.
Yeah, that's right. It would be one thing for tariffs to exist on the order of weeks or maybe even months. Like in
Yeah,
1971, it was there for 4 months.
yeah.
It did disrupt trade, so there's been some research on this. It was meaningful and led to job losses almost surely. But yeah, the longer tariffs are in place, especially for Canada, the worse and worse effect they have on Canada's economy, really shrinking our potential, lowering our productivity, potentially by quite a bit. And so our response, as we've been talking about, should be on making our economy more resilient in the face of this uncertainty, making sure that Canada's economy, even if there's a 25% tariff, is an attractive place to invest and grow. And we
That's
should
the
think
thing. I
about
mean, if we can get the investment dollars here, then that's the win.
And that's how we respond to other types of tax changes in the United States. And maybe thinking about tariffs as a tax change
Yeah,
can be helpful. If the US adopts a more competitive business income tax system, for example, we would not retaliate against
yeah,
that. We would think, oh, well, how can we improve our own business
yeah.
tax competitiveness? And so that's how I think we should respond here. The US has done something that itself will make Canada a less attractive place to invest and grow. So what do we do to offset that?
And we
And
see that in smaller levels. If one province gives Hollywood a tax break to come and shoot movies in Alberta, then Saskatchewan gives them an extra quarter of a point, and there they go. Like people, this is the kind of the business world.
yeah, I mean, I'm not a particular fan of subsidies to film
No,
and
I
television, but
understand.
but that is an idea that we should respond by thinking about how to improve our competitiveness in the face of this
Right.
external shock, and then engage on other issues like border security, military spending, and so on, as we have been doing. So the 1.3 billion being spent on improved border security, I don't know whether that's enough or not, but that's the
Yeah.
type of response that I think is potentially more productive than tariffs.
So a word or two on the, and we heard it again from ministers today that if this happens and if businesses are hurt and if workers are hurt, we're going to be there. We don't need to recall Parliament. We're just going to give people money. Um, Look, that happened at the front end of COVID. I think it saved an awful lot of individuals who couldn't go to work, but we carried on with the spending, and we ended up with a inflation and the affordability crisis everybody's dealing with now. This seems to be a go-to position, and I'm not sure it's the right response in this circumstance.
I agree, and it also I think exaggerates the scale of the challenge. COVID was a very unusual type
Yeah,
of
it's
shock,
a one-off. Yeah,
and a lot of the contraction in economic activity was policy driven in terms of restricting certain services, shutting down different areas of the economy, and so it was a government policy choice that was made, and therefore compensation as a result of that choice. I think about it a little differently than just broader economic disruption. So what would a 25% tariff across the board mean for Canada's economy? Well, I did some work for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce trying to model
Hmm.
what this is, and I find it would shrink Canada's economy by about 2.6%. Bank of Canada recently released some of their own internal analysis suggesting maybe the effect is about 2.4, so pretty close to each other. Major financial institutions have released modeling too. So we don't know exactly, but it's somewhere around 2, maybe as high as 4% of an economic hit to Canada, which would potentially increase the unemployment rate by
Yeah.
something by about 3 percentage points, bringing us close to 10%. So it would be a recession, but a medium sized recession. And that means our policy response should be no different than any kind of normal medium recession. We have the employment insurance program for a reason, and our existing tools would be able to respond as they would through any recession. So, rolling out exceptional programs, especially at the scale of the pandemic, I think would be quite inappropriate in the sense that we have pre-existing tools that can help Canadians through recessions like EI. And if we need to improve EI, and I think there's lots of reforms there
Yeah.
that can be on the table, that's a separate conversation.
Yeah. And have things maybe more income driven than category driven, right? So that seniors in need get the money, not just every senior. Some of those kinds of things.
I
I
couldn't
want
agree
to
more.
just end on boycotts because we are seeing this kind of quite nationalistic response, right? Which is we're going to the store and we're going to buy Canadian, but it's very, very difficult. We don't know where products originate because it
Yeah.
can be packaged in Canada or labeled in Canada. And a lot of the things that we think are Canadian are actually foreign owned or majority foreign owned. Um, how do you look at that as an economist? Is it just let people do their thing and at least they feel like they're participating, or is there some downside that you see economically?
Yeah, so boycotts have the same challenge as tariffs do as a retaliatory measure. One might think that removing, say, U.S. alcohol from the shelves would hurt U.S. alcohol producers. Now, this is one of these areas that has gotten outsized attention. Some
Yeah.
provinces even just literally removing U.S. alcohol from their store shelves. And like with tariffs, our purchases of alcohol from the United States are equivalent to about 0.5% of total US output. So even if through boycotts and consumers shifting to other things, we dropped our purchases of alcohol by 20%, just to pick a number, that would be equivalent to 0.1% of total US alcohol production. So it would not, again, meaningfully move the needle from the perspective of almost any producer in the United States, and therefore not be something that is actually pressuring the US or inducing any
Yeah.
kind of policy change south of the border. But I'm also, who am I to tell consumers what they
No, I
should
mean,
or
if it
shouldn't
makes you
purchase? And
feel
that's
better,
fine. That's
then
fine.
do it. I mean,
Yeah, but
there's
we shouldn't be under the
yeah,
impression
that
that
it's
it's an
creating
effective way
change.
to
Yeah,
pressure. And that also means, I think, for governments to make that choice for consumers by
right.
literally taking all of the products off the shelves. That's maybe not an appropriate
It's
policy
misleading.
response.
I think you quoted a US official the other day saying we're kind of in the middle of a performative trade war, right?
That's right. So that was Anne Applebaum. So I want to give full credit to her for what I thought is a pretty accurate description,
Yep.
a performative trade war, and accurate in terms of thinking about both sides of the border too. I think a lot of
Yeah.
our retaliatory measures, canceling Starlink, as you noted, the alcohol
Yeah.
is somewhat performative on
Yeah.
our part. And yeah, it does seem like the US is also engaging in this kind of trade policy performance through threats of tariffs and then not following through or delaying
Right.
them. So yeah, on both sides, it's really unfortunate though because it does add to uncertainty that
Yeah.
represents a big potential
And
economic
and
hit to
that's
Canada,
the
whether
vicious,
tariffs occur or not. We're
yeah,
incurring
vicious
economic loss.
circle about whether we are a place to do business and everything we do to undermine that is Really, really not helpful. Trevor, as always, it is amazing to talk with you about this. You're so clear. You've got the numbers. You're going to help us get through this performative trade war or whatever we're in. It certainly is political. I'm always optimistic that the president has a short attention span and he may move on, but we
Maybe.
can't
Here's
count on
hoping.
that.
Yeah, indeed.
So great to talk to you, and thanks for all the work that you do to keep us informed and keep our behavior sort of on track and useful as opposed to just political.
Well, thank you. It was a real
Trevor,
pleasure.
yeah, professor of economics at the University of Calgary, and then look at this work with the finances of the nations project, which because Trevor writes about this in places like the Hub. Where else can they? I mean, you're in newspapers, you're in legacy media as well. But if you see this byline, Trevor Tombe, Tombe, read it because it's fact based, it's important, and I'm just going to say thank you on behalf of an information starved country for
Well,
all that
thank
you
you.
do.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
We'll talk again soon, and that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We will talk with you very soon, too.